The central issue after 1848 was the expansion of slavery, pitting the anti-slavery elements in the North against the pro-slavery elements that dominated the South. Small number of active Northerners were abolitionists who declared that ownership of slaves was sin, in terms of Protestant theology, and demanded its immediate abolition. Much larger numbers in the North were against the expansion of slavery, seeking to put it on the path to extinction so that America would be committed to free land, as in low-cost farms owned and cultivated by family, free labor, and free speech as opposed to censorship of abolitionist material in the South. Southern whites insisted that slavery was of economic, social, and cultural benefit to all whites, and even to the slaves themselves, and denounced all anti-slavery spokesmen as abolitionists. 82. Justifications of slavery included economics, history, religion, legality, social good, and even humanitarianism, to further their arguments. Defenders of slavery argued that the sudden end to the slave economy would have had profound and killing economic impact in the South, where reliance on slave labor was the foundation of their economy. They also argued that if all the slaves were freed, there would be widespread unemployment and chaos. 83. Religious activists split on slavery, with the Methodists and Baptists dividing into Northern and Southern denominations. In the North, the Methodists, Congregationalists, and Quakers included many abolitionists, especially among women activists. The Catholic, Episcopal and Lutheran denominations largely ignored the slavery issue. 84. Compromise of 1850 and popular sovereignty. The issue of slavery in the new territories was seemingly settled by the Compromise of 1850, brokered by Whig Henry Clay and Democrat Stephen Douglas. The compromise included the admission of California as free state in exchange for no federal restrictions on slavery placed on Utah or New Mexico. 85. The point of contention was the Fugitive Slave Act, which increased federal enforcement and required even free states to cooperate in turning over fugitive slaves to their owners. Abolitionists pounced on the act to attack slavery, as in the best-selling anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. 86. The Compromise of 1820 was repealed in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, promoted by Senator Douglas in the name of popular sovereignty and democracy. It permitted voters to decide on the legality of slavery in each territory, and allowed Douglas to adopt neutrality on the issue of slavery. Anti-slavery forces rose in anger and alarm, forming the new Republican Party. Pro- and anti-contingents rushed to Kansas to vote slavery up or down, resulting in miniature civil war called Bleeding Kansas. By the late 1850s, the young Republican Party dominated nearly all northern states and thus the Electoral College. It insisted that slavery would never be allowed to expand, and thus would slowly die out. 87. The plantation economy. The southern slavery-based societies had become wealthy based on their cotton and other agricultural commodity production, and some particularly profited from the internal slave trade. Northern cities such as Boston and New York, and regional industries, were tied economically to slavery by banking, shipping, and manufacturing, including textile mills. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the South, nearly 8 times as many as there were nationwide in 1790. The plantations were highly profitable, due to the heavy European demand for raw cotton. Most of the profits were invested in new lands and in purchasing more slaves, largely drawn from the declining tobacco regions, the United States, immediately before the Civil War. All of the lands east of, or bordering, the Mississippi River were organized as states in the Union, but the West was still largely unsettled. For 50 of the nation's first 72 years, slaveholders served as President of the United States and, during that period, only slaveholding presidents were re-elected to second terms. 88. In addition, Southern states benefited by their increased apportionment in Congress due to the partial counting of slaves in their populations. Slave Rebellions, by Gabriel Prosser, 1800, Denmark Vesey, 1822, Ned Turner, 1831, and most famously by John Brown, 1859, caused fear in the white South, which imposed stricter oversight of slaves and reduced the rights of free blacks. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required the states to cooperate with slave owners when attempting to recover escaped slaves, which outraged Northerners. Formerly, an escaped slave that reached non-slave state was presumed to have attained sanctuary and freedom under the Missouri Compromise. The Supreme Court's 1857 decision in Dred Scott v. Sandford ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Angry Republicans said this decision threatened to make slavery a national institution. Lincoln and secession. After Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union and set up new nation, the Confederate States of America, Confederacy, on February 8, 1861. It attacked Fort Sumter, U.S. Army fort in South Carolina, thus igniting the war. When Lincoln called for troops to suppress the Confederacy in April 1861, 4 more states seceded and joined the Confederacy. Few, the northernmost, slave states did not secede and became known as the border states. These were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. During the war, the northwestern portion of Virginia seceded from the Confederacy and became the new Union state of West Virginia. 89. West Virginia is usually associated with the border states. Civil War. Main article, American Civil War. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when elements of 100,000 Confederate forces attacked U.S. military installation at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. In response to the attack, on April 15, Lincoln called on the states to send detachments totaling 75,000 troops to recapture forts, protect the capital, and preserve the Union, which in his view still existed intact despite the actions of the seceding states. The two armies had their first major clash at the First Battle of Bull Run, Battle of Manassas, ending in Union defeat, but, more importantly, proved to both the Union and Confederacy that the war would be much longer and bloodier than originally anticipated. 90. Lincoln with Allen Pinkerton and Major General John Alexander McClernand at the Battle of Antietam. The war soon divided into 2 theaters, Eastern and Western. In the Western theater, the Union was relatively successful, with major battles, such as Perryville and Shiloh, along with Union gunboat dominance of navigable rivers, producing strategic Union victories and destroying major Confederate operations. 91. Warfare in the Eastern theater began poorly for the Union as the Confederates won at Manassas Junction, Bull Run, just outside Washington. Major General George B. McClellan was put in charge of the Union armies. After reorganizing the new Army of the Potomac, McClellan failed to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia in his Peninsula Campaign and retreated after attacks from newly appointed Confederate General Robert E. Lee. 92. Meanwhile, both sides concentrated in 1861–62 on raising and training new armies. The main action was Union success in controlling the border states, with Confederates largely driven out of Maryland, West Virginia, a new state, Kentucky and Missouri. The autumn 1862 Confederate campaign into Maryland was designed to hurt Union morale and win European support. It ended with Confederate retreat at the Battle of Antietam, and Lincoln's warning he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 if the states did not return. Making slavery central war goal energized Republicans in the North, as well as their enemies, the anti-war, Copperhead Democrats. It ended the risk of British and French intervention. Lee's smaller army won at the Battle of Fredericksburg late in 1862, causing yet another change in commanders. Lee won again at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, while losing his top aide, Stonewall Jackson. But Lee pushed too hard and ignored the Union threat in the West. Lee invaded Pennsylvania in search of supplies and to cause war weariness in the North. In perhaps the turning point of the war, Lee's army was badly beaten at the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1–3, 1863, and barely made it back to Virginia. 93. On the home front, industrial expansion in the North expanded dramatically, using its extensive railroad service, and moving industrial workers into munitions factories. Foreign trade increased, with the United States providing both food and cotton to Britain, and Britain sending in manufactured products and thousands of volunteers for the Union Army, plus few to the Confederates. The British operated blockade runners bringing in food, luxury items and munitions to the Confederacy, bringing out tobacco and cotton. The Union blockade increasingly shut down Confederate ports, and by late 1864 the blockade runners were usually captured before they could make more than a handful of runs. Menu 000 Modern recording of Gettysburg Address originally spoken by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. The Battle of Franklin, November 30, 1864 in the West. On July 4, 1863, Union forces under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant gained control of the Mississippi River at the Battle of Vicksburg, thereby splitting the Confederacy. Lincoln made General Grant commander of all Union armies. Grant put General William Tecumseh Sherman in charge of the Western armies. In 1864, Sherman marched south from Chattanooga to capture Atlanta, decisive victory that ended war jitters among Republicans in the North who feared they might fail to re-elect Lincoln in 1864. Lincoln won landslide. The last 2 years of the war were bloody for both sides, with Sherman marching almost unopposed through central and eastern Georgia, then moving up through South Carolina and North Carolina, burning cities, destroying plantations, ruining railroads and bridges, but avoiding civilian casualties. Sherman demonstrated that the South lacked the long-term ability to resist Northern invasion. Much of the heartland of the Confederacy was physically destroyed, and could no longer provide desperately needed food, horses, mules, wagons, boots or munitions to its combat armies. In spring 1864 Grant, realizing that Lee was unable to replenish his casualties, while Lincoln would provide replacements for Union losses, launched War of Attrition against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. This War of Attrition was divided into 3 main campaigns. The first of these, the Overland Campaign, forced Lee to retreat into the city of Petersburg, where Grant launched his second major offensive, the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, in which he besieged Petersburg. After a near 10-month siege, Petersburg surrendered. However, the defense of Fort Gregg allowed Lee to move his army out of Petersburg. Grant pursued and launched the final, Appomattox Campaign, which resulted in Lee surrendering his Army of Northern Virginia numbering 28,000 on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse. Other Confederate armies followed suit and the war ended with no post-war insurgency. The American Civil War was the world's earliest industrial war. Railroads, the telegraph, steamships, and mass-produced weapons were employed extensively. The mobilization of civilian factories, mines, shipyards, banks, transportation and food supplies all foreshadowed the impact of industrialization in World War I. It remains the deadliest war in American history, resulting in the deaths of about 750,000 soldiers and an undetermined number of civilian casualties. 94. About 10% of all Northern males 20 to 45 years old, and 30% of all Southern white males aged 18 to 40 died. 95. Its legacy includes ending slavery in the United States, restoring the Union, and strengthening the role of the federal government. According to historian Alan Nevins, the Civil War had major long-term impact on the United States in terms of developing its leadership potential and moving the entire nation beyond the adolescent stage. The fighting and its attendant demands upon industry, finance, medicine, and law also helped train a host of leaders who during the next 35 years, to 1900, made their influence powerfully felt on most of the social, economic, and cultural fronts. It broke down barriers of parochialism. It ended distrust of large-scale effort. It hardened and matured the whole people emotionally. The adolescent land of the 1850s rose under the blows of battle to adult estate. The nation of the post-Appomattox generation, though sadly hurt, especially in the South, by war losses, and deeply scarred psychologically, especially in the North, by war hatreds and greeds, had at last the power, resolution, and self-trust of manhood. 96. Emancipation. See also, Military History of African Americans in the American Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation. First reading of the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln by Francis Bicknell Carpenter. 97. People in the image are clickable. Menu 000 Modern reading of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, giving freedom to all African Americans who resided within the Confederacy but not those within the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863. In single stroke it changed the legal status, as recognized by the U.S. government, of million slaves in designated areas of the Confederacy from slave to free. It had the practical effect that as soon as slave escaped the control of the Confederate government, by running away or through advances of federal troops, the slave became legally and actually free. The owners were never compensated. Plantation owners, realizing that emancipation would destroy their economic system, sometimes moved their slaves as far as possible out of reach of the Union Army. By June 1865, the Union Army controlled all of the Confederacy and liberated all of the designated slaves. 98. Large numbers moved into camps run by the Freedmen's Bureau, where they were given food, shelter, medical care, and arrangements for their employment were made. The severe dislocations of war and Reconstruction had large negative impact on the black population, with large amount of sickness and death. 99. Reconstruction Era Main article, Reconstruction Era. See also, History of the United States, 1865 to 1918, Freedmen voting in New Orleans, 1867. Reconstruction lasted from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863 to the Compromise of 1877. 100. The major issues faced by Lincoln were the status of the ex-slaves, called freemen, the loyalty and civil rights of ex-rebels, the status of the 11 ex-Confederate states, the powers of the federal government needed to prevent future civil war, and the question of whether Congress or the President would make the major decisions. The severe threats of starvation and displacement of the unemployed freedmen were met by the first major federal relief agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, operated by the Army. 101. 3 Reconstruction Amendments were passed to expand civil rights for Black Americans. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal rights for all and citizenship for blacks. The 15th Amendment prevented race from being used to disenfranchise men. Radical Reconstruction. Ex-Confederates remained in control of most Southern states for over 2 years, but changed when the Radical Republicans gained control of Congress in the 1866 elections. President Andrew Johnson, who sought easy terms for reunions with ex-rebels, was virtually powerless in the face of the Radical Republican Congress. He was impeached, but the Senate's attempt to remove him from office failed by 1 vote. Congress enfranchised black men and temporarily stripped many ex-Confederate leaders of the right to hold office. New Republican governments came to power based on coalition of freedmen made up of carpetbaggers, new arrivals from the North, and scalawags, native white Southerners. They were backed by the U.S. Army. Opponents said they were corrupt and violated the rights of whites. 102. The KKK and the rise of Jim Crow. Atlanta's rail yard and roundhouse in ruins shortly after the end of the Civil War. State by state they lost power to conservative Democratic coalition, which gained control of the entire South by 1877. In response to radical Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, emerged in 1867 as white supremacist organization opposed to black civil rights and Republican rule. President Ulysses Grant's vigorous enforcement of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1870 shut down the Klan, and disbanded. Paramilitary groups, such as the White League and Red Shirts, emerged about 1874 that worked openly to use intimidation and violence to suppress black voting to regain white political power in states across the South during the 1870s. Rabel described them as the military arm of the Democratic Party. 102. Reconstruction ended after the disputed 1876 election. The Compromise of 1877 gave Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes the White House in exchange for removing all remaining federal troops in the South. The federal government withdrew its troops from the South, and Southern Democrats took control of every Southern state. 103. From 1890 to 1908, Southern states effectively disfranchised most black voters and many poor whites by making voter registration more difficult through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other arbitrary devices. They passed segregation laws and imposed second-class status on blacks in a system known as Jim Crow that lasted until the Civil Rights Movement. 104. 105.